In recent months, we've been roasting the Papua New Guinea coffee here at the Virtual Coffee Lab. We've roasted it on this drum roaster with excellent results. We've also roasted it on the hive as well as the fresh roast. Today we're going to be doing the same coffee on the Sweet Maria's popper. We're going to be talking about some of the features of the popper, some of its strengths, some of its weaknesses, and ultimately we're going to be tasting the coffee to see if we can get close to the great results we've had on these other roasters. So stick around. All right, thanks for joining me today. This is not all about the popper. This video is not about a critique of the popper, although we're using it, and I'm going to share some of my experiences trying to take this Papua New Guinea coffee that we've enjoyed so much over the last month or two and apply that towards this roaster. One of the things that we've been talking about are key elements when we take a profile and share it across other roasting devices. We talked about the end color, we talked about the end temperature, we talked about times of the events, how long the coffee is roasting within this Maillard or middle phase, the first crack time event, as well as the amount of time spent in development. All of these things are critical to having a coffee that can be shared across different roasting devices. So that's what we're trying to do here at the Virtual Coffee Lab, is experience that for ourselves and learn from it. So today we're going to go roast this coffee on the popper. I've already done this roast and I'm going to be narrating it and sharing some of the things that I learned while using the popper. For those who don't have the popper, don't focus on the roasting device itself as much as some of the elements and the realizations, the things we learn from going through this roast together. I am using Artisan. I'm only going to be using one probe. I did some other test roast with both probes, and unfortunately the exhaust temperature probe, the inlet temperature, the long probe that I use for some of my other roasts that goes into the bean mass and down close right against where the heat comes out, that causes the movement of the beans to be restricted. And so I didn't want to have any sort of an influence on uneven roasts, that type of thing. I wanted to have as much bean movement as possible. That's one of the things about the Sweet Maria's popper, is that it doesn't have the same amount of fan power as, say, the fresh roast does. So you don't get quite as much bean movement. You do get enough lofting as soon as the moisture starts to be released from the bean. During the evaporation process, the beans get lighter and then they start to loft, and you'll see that in the video. So I'm using one probe, and it's going to be the bean temperature probe, and I'm placing this just above the bean mass, like it's almost touching the bean mass, and then as the roast begins, it will start to touch the beans. All right, the other thing as a note is that because I'm using this probe and I didn't want to drill holes into the roaster, I have the lid cracked open in the back, which causes some of the chaff to come out. So you'll see chaff come out as well. Okay, so we are roasting 100 grams of the Papua New Guinea coffee, and I'm going to go ahead and get the beans into the roaster, place the probe in place, and then we'll get the roast started. One of the other things that I really don't like about the popper is the yellow top. It's very difficult to be able to see color, and I didn't want to open the roaster up because I know that would let some heat out. And so I did my best to determine my color with a light through the yellow tinted cover. Okay, so I've got the fan setting on high, and I've also changed the dial. The dial here, instead of me using like a clock type digits, I numbered them 1 through 6, I think it is. If you look here, you'll see that dial. And so I'm going to try to correlate that with the power buttons, although I didn't get that quite fully set up. So when I actually hit the power button on Artisan to mark it, you might see a different number show up. We're going to be starting with a 3. That's the 12 o'clock position for the Sweet Maria's popper. And we're going to get this roast started. Got it all set up. And I'm going to turn on the motor as well as hit the charge button at the same time. And immediately you'll see the bean temperature rise. That's a good sign. The thermocouple is working, it is reading, and we're already at closing in on 150 degrees for the roast. I noticed while using the popper and having the probe placed here that my dry event time is going to happen between 325 and 340, depending upon how hard I'm pushing the coffee. That temperature will vary. I'm also using an extension cord on this roast, and it says very clearly on the instructions not to use an extension cord, but I'm using an extension cord just because of my roasting environment. So, full transparency there. All right, my target time is about 4 minutes for the roast, maybe a little bit longer than that. And based on that dry end time, I'm going to set my time in my mind for first crack. So it could be anywhere from 7 minutes to 7:30 for first crack, and then my development time will be based on that as well. So everything is all about when I can get this coffee to the dry time, and then from that time to the next time, my target is about 3 minutes, and then from first crack until development, my target is about 2 minutes of roasting. So take a look at the dotted arm that's pointing upwards. And then if you look along the timeline here, I think for dry, my goal is about 4 minutes. So I'm using this angle on the bean temperature, this blue line, you'll see the dashes after it, and I'm just kind of looking to where that's pointing on the timeline when we get near the temperature range. Probably, I'm going to say, just to keep it easy, 350 degrees. And we'll see that I'm starting to head in that direction, so I'm comfortable with the progress of the roast, but I'm using my heat to make adjustments to ensure that I have a good temperature increase that's going to get me to my goal. You'll also notice that my rate of rise, that's the blue line that's coming down from the top, is all over the place. And you'll see the big squiggles there, and that's because I made some temperature changes. But ultimately, getting a nice descending rate of rise on the popper is almost impossible. I was able to do it once, and I can show you that picture here. You can take a look at that. But the result of that roast, my events didn't happen when I wanted them to happen. The tasting profile was off, and the coffee was a little underdeveloped. So it just moved too quickly. Okay, so as I make these power adjustments, you'll see the rate of rise go back up again, and you'll see that power adjustment here in just a minute. One of the things that I don't like about the Sweet Maria's power settings, and I've mentioned a few things already that I don't like about the popper, but I'll talk about the things that I do like here at the end. There's my color check. You'll see that the beans are definitely starting to yellow. But one of the things I don't like about this power setting is when I move from 4 to 4 1/4, or from 3 1/2 to 3 3/4. These minor changes, sometimes I don't get any sort of a temperature change. So the Sweet Maria's popper circuitry, the way that it works, it's definitely incremented in steps greater than just, it's not, if you move the dial just a little bit, it may not affect the temperature. And so I'm moving more or less in half steps to try to achieve this. And now I've moved the power up to 5 because I want to continue to my next goal. I've reached dry end. It was 4 minutes and 10 seconds. My next goal is to try to reach first crack around 7 minutes and 15 seconds. And so I want to make sure that I have my power setting so that I'm going to be about 400 degrees, because that's about when first crack hits at the 7 minute mark. 400 degrees on this roaster. On other roasters, that varies, and the total roast time can vary when crack happens. But in this instance, my expectation is around 400 degrees first crack will take place. So I am looking at that dashed bar, and I want to have at 7 minutes, I want that to be close to 400 degrees. What I don't want to do is I don't want to do that too soon, because when I do that, then the coffee will crack early. There were actually a couple early cracks when I started to push the coffee, and I brought the coffee temperature back down because there's coffee that's right down near that heater, right down near that inlet where the hot air comes out, that's not moving a lot. And by me making a sudden change of temperature like that, it could cause some of those beans to crack because they're close to their first crack temperature. So I'm being careful about my heat management on that. All right, now look at the dashed line. We're moving close to that 7 minute mark and the 400 degree line, and that's my goal, is to get there a little after 7 minutes. All right, we'll take a look at the beans again here in a little bit, but I have had to move this heat back and forth. I did a couple roasts where every 4 or 5 seconds I would go from 4 to 4.5 and then back and forth, back and forth. And when I was monitoring my exhaust temperature, that's the red line on the bottom that's not being used right now. But when I was monitoring that on some of my earlier test roasts, I was able to control the heat much better, but I was constantly having to play with it. So I don't want to do that. All right, so now we're at 7 minutes, and I want to start to get this coffee to crack. So I've bumped the temperature up, and I'm waiting for this to move into first crack. Look at my rate of rise. It was plummeting, and now it's climbing again. Very frustrating, very frustrating. All right, first crack, 7 minutes and 28 seconds. So I was about 15 seconds behind where I really wanted to be on my first crack, but not too bad. Especially for the popper, that's not bad at all. Okay, so now my next thing that I want to do is I do want to have an increasing temperature, but I want to have it at a very slow rate. So if you look at over to the right, the BT in the red box right now says like 14, 16. I really would like that to be around 8 or 9 or something like that. But right now we're kind of climbing because I want to get this crack to roll, and then from there we will control the temperature. So now I've got my bean temperature increase, the rate of rise increase, coming back down a little bit into the 8 or 9 range, and then it will sort of stay in that range for most of the rest of the roast. You can see the lofting here. The lofting is definitely bean movement, so I'm really happy with that. Now it's just all about getting this coffee to be fully developed. All right, so we are at the 9 minute mark, and I'm going to go a little longer on my bean development here. You can see my percentage is around 17, and in hindsight, I'm thinking I probably should have dropped the coffee right around now, or maybe in about another 5 or 10 seconds, but I went a little longer than that. I went another 15 seconds longer than that, as you'll see here. So my rate of rise is around 12 right now, and it's going to start jumping up. So I don't want that to happen, and I've already made an adjustment to my heat to bring that back down. And now I'm going to go into the cool mode. So there you go, 9:37 or 9:38, 9:40 for my drop time. And now what I'm going to do is get this coffee out of the roaster as quick as possible, because I already went longer than I wanted to, and I don't want this to go through the Sweet Maria popper cool down, because it's not as quick as my fan cooler tray for my drum roaster here. Okay, here you can see the beans. They've cooled down. The color on these, they're definitely not real dark and wet looking. There's no oils at all. We did not hit second crack. Definitely not. There are a couple of Quakers in there that you can see. Those are the lighter colored beans. Overall, the variation in color isn't bad. It's not that bad at all. I would have loved to have had more bean movement during the dry time to help promote a little bit more of an even roast, but I'm happy with that. And the color doesn't look too bad. At a first glance, it seems like it's pretty close to what I had on the drum roaster. But now let's take a look at the profile that we ended up with, and then we'll actually look at the colors of the coffee before we get into the taste. Okay, rate of rise all over the place. I don't even want to talk about rate of rise. I'm not really excited about that. Will that influence the taste? Obviously, it can. I think it can influence the taste. My goal is to have a nice declining rate of rise. Have I had good coffee with a rate of rise all over the place? Sure, I have. So depending upon who you talk to and depending upon how sensitive your palate is, you may notice defects in the flavor based on a rate of rise. I know that there's some pretty prominent educators in coffee roasting that talk about that. And so I'm not going to argue that point whatsoever. My goal is to always have a nice descending rate of rise. Okay, as far as the total roast time was 9 minutes and 40 seconds. That is within the scope of what we were targeting for our times. If you compare that to the drum roaster total roast time, this is shorter, but our dry was shorter as well. The amount of time that we spent in the middle phase was definitely longer than we wanted. We wanted to have around a 7:15. That would have put us at about a 35% time in our middle phase, and I think that affected some of the overall tasting notes, some of the flavors. I think the coffee flattened out a little bit with that longer browning Maillard phase. Okay, and then the development phase was a little long as well. 23% is what it shows on Artisan here. I know that I was a couple percent over where I would normally go, probably 3 or 4% over where we were going on the drum roaster as well. So slightly overdeveloped compared to the roast as well. So it wasn't the same roast. I don't expect to have the exact same flavor, the taste in the cup. I expect it to be less interesting, and I expect it to be definitely darker flavor notes in the coffee. My hope is that we end up having some of the Papua New Guinea notes come out, where the distinctive rustic notes, and hopefully I won't be tasting char in the cup here. So let's get to the color analysis, and then we'll get to the cup. Okay, first I want to show you a whole bean comparison. On the right is the Papua New Guinea coffee done on the drum roaster, and on the left is the Sweet Maria's popper. You can clearly see that the beans on the left are darker than the beans on the right. Look at the texture of the beans. There are some wrinkles on the Papua New Guinea on the left. There are more wrinkles, more modeling on the beans on the right. So we're definitely going to have some darker notes just based on observation of the bean color of the whole bean. Then we go to I ground the coffee, and I wanted you to see it's even more clear the color difference between the beans done in the popper. I roasted them too long, too dark. The temperature, that's an indicator of temperatures. The temperatures were higher on this popper than what we ended up with using on our drum roaster. You can't use and compare the same temperatures with the probe. They won't be consistent. They won't be comparable from machine to machine. But you can compare color, and that's what we're doing here. And this is showing me that this coffee went to a higher temperature on the right than the coffee on the left. So when somebody says to you, hey, look at my beans, how do they look? Well, you don't have anything to compare to, and we ultimately don't know how they taste, and we know nothing about the profile they used. We only know about the end temperature they took the coffee to. All right, and just for kicks, I threw in another roast using the popper that I did previous to that, which was a little underdeveloped. This is the roast that had that really steep declining rate of rise with a shorter total roast time, and you can see the bean color difference in that. It's definitely a lighter roast, but it's very interesting to see those three. All right, one other thing I did was I cracked open the beans. That's something that you can do. You want to check for evenness of your roast. I'm talking about even through the bean. Crack the beans open, take a look, and compare the inside color with the outside color. And it's something to look for. So always crack your beans open, take a look at the color, and see what you learn about your roast. If it's not even, then you want to slow your roast down. You want to be a little more gentle with your heat application during the roast. Okay, so I ground the coffee and I used the Clever Dripper. And you can see a couple shots of me brewing the coffee. Okay, so now comes the taste. I've roasted this coffee several days ago. It's had a chance to rest. And we're going to taste this now and see if it's anything like what we've had on the drum roaster. We've already looked at the color of this coffee, which is already going to give us an indication that it is going to be different than the roasts that we've had before. It has that Papua New Guinea kind of a rustic aroma. I call it kind of a jungle hempy kind of an aroma. It does smell a little sweet. It's a medium body coffee. I am getting that Papua New Guinea origin, that distinct note. I'm not getting much sweetness. I am getting a very darker note. It's like a real dark chocolate, baker's chocolate. There is a real gentle citrus, kind of a lemony note. Nothing really significant or noticeable. The aftertaste is a little dirty. It's not a clean finish. And it's just kind of like the rustic note sitting on my tongue. So all in all, it's not a bad coffee, but it's not what we were getting out of the drum roaster and the fresh roast. And I think the difference is, as we've been talking about, color. I showed you the images of the different beans and then the grounds and then opening and cracking up the beans. Those are really important lessons for us to remember. This is not a coffee that I would be ashamed to share with anyone, but it's definitely for those that like the darker notes. It's not burnt. It's not carbonized. You know, it didn't reach second crack. Obviously, you could see from the bean that there were no oils on it at all. What would I do differently? I would definitely shorten the development time on this. And unfortunately, with the popper, it's very difficult to be able to control all of that. Is the popper a bad roaster? It's not a bad roaster. It's a very affordable roaster. It's a great entry point. Right now, they don't have any available. They've got a second generation coming out to be able to go and roast a little darker. So they should be coming out anytime. But yeah, I think that this has been a great learning experience for me, and I hope it has been for you. Color is king. I think that even Rob Hoos mentioned that if you can get the color of the coffee close when you share a profile and go from one roaster to another type of roaster, color is king. And then after that, we take a look at our event times to try to correlate those, and we should get pretty close. Here we got fairly close with our event times. The color was off, and we can taste that in the cup. So lesson learned there, and I hope that you guys appreciated that and learned something from it as well. Share your thoughts and comments as far as your ability to use color while you roast. I'd like to hear if any of you even consider looking at the color of your beans and comparing that to previous roasts. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope you guys have a great week roasting, and we'll see you next time. Take care.